Welcome. Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Jessica Landacre, and I'm the Executive Director of IPO. I have the honor of introducing the final session of this virtual awards celebration entitled Breaking Barriers in Innovation, a conversation about diversity and inclusion. I hope that you have been inspired as I have by the distinguished honorees and esteemed panelists featured this week. The IPO Education Foundation was incorporated in 2000 to promote awareness about the value of intellectual property to our lives and our economy. It's my privilege to be a part of the 20th anniversary of this organization. As you may have already heard, the Board of Directors has made an exciting and important change by adopting a new strategic priority focused on programming that benefits underrepresented communities. Activities in 2021 will target innovation and creation by, within, and for these communities. Programs will be developed with the goal of encouraging innovation and the acquisition of intellectual property rights in underrepresented communities, thereby creating economic prosperity. We hope you will support us as we take on this new initiative. The foundation is entirely funded by contributions, so please consider making a donation by selecting the Donate Now button on the IPOEF.org website. We greatly appreciate your support. And now I'd like to introduce Phyllis Turner-Brim, Deputy General Counsel and Chief of Intellectual Property at HP Inc. and member of the IPO Education Foundation Board of Directors. She will lead a conversation with Dr. Lisa Cook, Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University, about how the exclusion of people of color and women has impacted innovation. They will discuss what the inventor and practitioner community could really look like with the removal of certain barriers. After they finish their conversation, please join IPO's Diversity and Inclusion Committee for a networking workshop. Thank you again for supporting the IPO Education Foundation, and best wishes for a safe and healthy new year.
Thanks, Jessica, for that lovely introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here with a, I will definitely say a friend and someone who I've chatted with on occasion, Dr. Lisa Cook. And I really want her to be the star of this show, so I'm going to minimize my comments as much as possible. Lisa, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. And can you first of all,
mine, Phyllis.
Oh, first of all, can you tell us, you're an economist, and tell us a little bit of what inspired you to become an economist. You know, how did you come to select that as a profession?
This is a really amazing and awkward story. I started Spelman College as a physics and philosophy major, and I got a bachelor's degree in philosophy and wound up going to Oxford as a Marshall Scholar, read PPE there, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And I wound up going to the University of Dakar in Senegal, thinking that I wanted to do a PhD in philosophy. Of course, well, not of course, but at the time, there was no concentration in African philosophy in a graduate program. So I needed to go to Africa to prove that this could be done, that I had the resources, the advisors to be able to constitute a committee. So while I was there and enrolled in a master's program, I'd say within the first week, I started asking some fundamental questions that had nothing to do with philosophy. Why do some countries grow more slowly than others? I had never lived in a developing country. It was stark. You know, the first thing that I did was to buy a big pen, you know, the kind that come 10 in a pack, and I paid $10 for that pen. And, you know, I freaked out because I was thinking, now that is a significant share of monthly income for the average person in this economy. So how on earth can people afford it? Like, how can the students afford it and all the other things they need to pay for it to go to college? And it bugged me. So a lot of the questions that had to do with economic development started nagging at me, and growth started nagging at me. So at the end of my time, I was climbing Kilimanjaro. Of course, I showed up there by myself, and I had no idea that my little plan to go walk around the base of the mountain and have some ice cream in the visitor shop and look at some photos in the visitor shop would be completely misguided. You either climbed the mountain or you didn't. There was no visitor shop, there was no ice cream, no nothing. So everybody who showed up as a singleton was matched someone else. Luckily, I was matched with a Cambridge trained economist. And for 5 hours, you climb to each hut. For 5 hours, we talked about this dilemma that I had. There were some burning questions that I wanted to answer. And frankly, I had already been admitted to LSE to do a PhD in mathematical logic, something very, very narrow that would not necessarily help me answer these questions. So there's this tussle, this tug and pull going on in my mind. And he just behaved like any good dad, any good advisor, any good uncle. And he just said, okay, let me tell you what you need to do. You need to do a PhD in economics. I did it. My son just finished one and a PhD in agricultural economics at one of the great universities. I think it was Minnesota in the US. And these are all the great questions that you can try to answer with the mathematical tools that you clearly have. And he just said, okay, well, you'll probably need to take this course and that course, the various courses that I needed to take, most of them, differential equations or linear algebra, not a big deal given what I'd done before. And the key thing was, he had no judgment whatsoever. He just said, okay, you need to pick these up. It's not a big deal. You just pick these up and then apply to grad schools and you'll be ready to go. When I presented the same idea to people in the US, let's say a year later, even 6 months later, there was a concerted effort to discourage me from doing a PhD in economics, especially from graduate students. So I went to several programs around the country and talked to them about their programs, and most of these were top 35 programs or so. And in fact, most of them top 15. And typically I wound up in a gathering with graduate students, and the male graduate students were just absolutely keen on discouraging me from doing a PhD in economics. It was the strangest thing. I had a lot more support, including from Kamala Harris's dad, Don Harris at Stanford, and Sandy Darity at UNC, at the time at UNC Chapel Hill, now at Duke. But I just had a lot of people encouraging me to do this. And I actually did the summer program that I now direct at Michigan State. It was at Stanford at the time, which is how I wound up meeting Don Harris. And, things have just been written a different way since then. And I'm just grateful to have had mentors like Milton Friedman and George Akerlof, Paul Romer, the Nobel laureates who've contributed a lot to the economics profession. So that was an anomaly. The visits to programs were anomalies, but I'm grateful that I had that introduction that I had on Kilimanjaro.
Wow, what a story. I can only say that for myself, and probably for many of the other, in particular, African-American women who are in the patent profession, as I am, that story is not completely foreign to us, in that we are frequently not welcomed into this profession as and identified as people who would be successful.
Right. Okay.
But also that many of us didn't begin our journey saying, I'm going to be a patent lawyer. Like, for example, myself, I didn't even know patent lawyer was a profession until I was out in the world working. So you become exposed to things and then you try something new.
Right.
Well, I have seen you and heard you on a lot of media outlets recently about some of the research that you've been doing. Tell us a little bit about the topics that have drawn all this interest in this era, and how you came to select those topics as things you wanted to conduct research around.
When I was doing my PhD at Berkeley, in economics, in the economics department, I decided to do it on the Russian banking system. And because the data was so poor about the economy, about banking, just about anything related to Russia, I actually needed to learn Russian and move there to be able to execute my survey. So I had a survey company that was doing some surveys, well, doing the bulk of the surveys, but what you had to do in Russia at the time was to make sure that they were actually interviewing the people they said they were, and entrepreneurs and bankers. Those were the people I was interviewing and that were in the survey. But I had to do this on my own, the top bankers and some random entrepreneurs. So I was doing that. I had some really interesting conversations with them. And one thing they posed to me was this, and this is from both groups: why can't innovation come to Russia? We've got great human capital. We left over from the Soviet Union, big investment, and we also have talented people, and we have intellectual property rights on the books. And the conventional wisdom in the early 2000s was, if intellectual property rights existed, that was enough. If there was intellectual property protection, that was enough. That is not a sufficient condition, because that's exactly what they had, but they saw no innovative firms setting up there. They didn't see IBM setting up a research center there at the time. This is in the mid-1990s. So, I told them, those are really good questions. I'm so sorry that I can't answer them because I've got a dissertation to write, but let me get back to you. I'll put that on the back burner. And I did finish my dissertation, and the question kept eating at me. Okay, so why is it that that's not sufficient? Why is that not enough in this context? So I said, well, is there an historical experiment that would enlighten the Russians about what's happening that would be similar to the conditions they have? And I started thinking about African-American inventors, all inventors, and especially African-American inventors, who would have been shocked by this external shock called violence in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, what you have to have in an experiment, as you know, is you have to have a control group and you have to have a treatment group. And the African-American inventors would be the treated group, and the white inventors would be the control group. So what happens when there is such a shock? And what I saw, using lynchings, riots, and segregation laws as proxies for violence, you see a drop in patenting and innovation. And when it ceases, you see it rise. So we have a good, sufficient condition. It's not a necessary condition, but a sufficient condition. And I think the striking thing about what I learned immediately was that 1899 was the peak year, and still is the peak year for patenting per capita for African Americans. The size of a patent team is still one. The median size is still one for African Americans 100 years later. This is a golden age of the independent inventor. But the average size, the median size for a patent team in the patent data now, the US patent data now, is much larger. It was 2 at the time. The last time I measured it was 2010, but it was growing. The median size was growing. And you can imagine for chemical patents, for example, you can think of 20 people being on a patent, and those are becoming much more common in the patent data set. But it was still 1 for African Americans 100 years later. It had not reached that peak again. So this is something that would have a persistent effect on patenting, and therefore on innovation, and therefore on economic growth. And this wasn't a small effect. The number of patents that I said were missing, that I calculated were missing, were equivalent to the size of a medium-sized European country at the time. And that wasn't small. They were quite inventive, and they were using the US Patent Office like many other countries did. They were innovative. They wanted to be determined to be the first to patent something, the first person with the idea. So they used the US Patent Office. So this was a really, really stark finding.
So what method did you use in terms of determining who's an African American or Black inventor?
A good question, because race data are not recorded on patents, as you know. I thought it was going to be easy. I thought what I was going to do was go to the websites of HBCUs and just see who had a patent, and that was going to be sufficient. That was a rude awakening because I thought I'd be able to identify Black names and then match them to the, after not finding anything from HBCU websites, or not much, I thought that maybe I could use Black names, just as many were in the early 90s. Bertrand Mullnathan, Fryer and Levitt, economists who sort of really catapulted this Black names literature into public discourse. So I tried that, and they used post-civil rights era names, so post-1970, and they used a census. Those names didn't work for this data set that went from 1870 to 1940. You couldn't expect it to work, but we didn't have any record of systematic historical Black names. So the first thing I had to do was come up with some data set that was the first recorded list of historical Black names for African Americans. I used the census to compare these. And this was, I think, something that was really enlightening, but I spent roughly a year doing that. So I picked up some people, but it really didn't pick up a lot of people. So that was one thing that I did. Another thing that I did was, when that didn't prove satisfactory, I looked for other hypotheses. So how were African Americans named? What are the naming conventions? So I read about that, and there was this myth that African Americans were disproportionately named after presidents. So I looked up that too. Well, it turns out all men are named after presidents, right? All men in this country. There was just a lot of geographic variation. You wouldn't find, for example, an Abraham Lincoln Smith in Alabama, right? I mean, you'd find one in Illinois, but not in Alabama. So that kind of variation existed. I only found like 3 inventors during that period named that way. Say George Washington Carver was one of them. So I had to go back to square one. Then I decided to try to find the universe of inventors, like just come up with those people and see if they had a patent. So I looked at directories, all kinds of directories on the web of inventors who may or may not have had a patent. I mean, listed as having or not having a patent. Biographies, collections of biographies, any roles from the National Society of Black Engineers. I talked to a lot of, some patent attorneys, but certainly the president of, it wasn't the president of the National Bar Association, it was the person who headed the patent law section of the National Bar Association. And he gave me the history of patent lawyers. Didn't know that there were only African-American patent lawyers starting in the 1970s. So they weren't interacting with Black patent lawyers. That was interesting to learn. I looked at obituaries, because one thing that I was really concerned about was that I was getting the famous people. If I were looking at lists of biographies or edited volumes of biographies, of course, the famous people are going to be covered, but not the regular patentee. And as you know, patent data are filled with people, just regular people. They're not all famous, and their inventions aren't all famous. So I looked at obituaries too. And often family members are very proud of what their family member has done, even though they may not identify themselves that way. Granville T. Woods and Thomas Edison identified themselves as machinists in the census, right? So when the census taker was talking to them, they identified themselves not as inventors, but as machinists. So families might be a bit more effusive in talking about the contributions of their family member. So I used everything. And of course, there was this survey of patent agents and patent attorneys in 1900 and 1913 by Henry Baker, a Black patent examiner who lost his job when Wilson segregated the civil service. So this was a bad consequence for him, a negative consequence for a number of African Americans in important positions of invention, of doing invention within the federal government or procuring inventions within the federal government. So that's what I did. I found all these names, started with this survey. The survey wasn't perfect. It didn't identify the first African American patentee in 1821, but it gave me a good start. So I had expanded in both directions from 1930 forward, and from, I think it was 1834 is when his data set started. I had to go backwards. So I had a bit of a start, but had to do a whole lot more work.
Well, I think that, listening to that, being a person who participates in the innovation in community, that was innovative in and of itself. As you were describing that, I was thinking, gosh, I wonder, is there a way to deploy, artificial intelligence in the future to be able to do these kinds of things after you have gathered this information and utilize these techniques? So you yourself are an innovator in this space in helping us to understand.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And this is definitely pre-Google patents, right? This is pre-machine learning and everything. This was showing up at Howard University and going through their archives. It's getting faxes from the National Archives. I mean, this is ancient. This is real shoe leather stuff. But I also understood, I think, a lot more by having to interact with people and to look at the original documents.
Mm-hmm. And this sounds also just a lot like what people have to do, particularly those who come from, who are descendants of enslaved people, to find out even their family histories, is you have to engage in this massive investigative activity to understand who your ancestors were.
Absolutely.
So tell me about what you think, one of the tragedies that I see in terms of the exclusion of, in particular, African Americans from this innovation activity, for whatever reason, violence, discrimination, Jim Crow, you name it, is what is lost. So what is your perspective on what we've lost as a society, be it in, you remember when you and I had a conversation years ago, I said, until you economists can put a number on it, nobody's going to pay attention. Right? So, tell us about what have we lost? What has been the impact on our society of exclusion of this body of patentees?
Since my paper was published, there have been several papers that have tried to put a number on it. So I was interested in what happens to economic growth. So I imputed that from what would happen if this happened to all inventors and not just Black inventors. And one thing we know is that patenting definitely would have declined, innovation would have declined, business investment would have declined, and GDP would have declined. So this was just the exercise, the calculation that I did. But I have looked more broadly. My co-author Yan Yang and I have come up with a calculation that 0.6% to 4.4% GDP per capita could be ours if we allowed more women and underrepresented minorities to participate in the innovative process, right? So that's what we're losing out on. 0.6% to 4.4% of GDP per capita. It could be a lot higher. Other friends have done this. Chang Shea and his co-authors have looked at the misallocation of talent since the Jim Crow period And what they find is that GDP is 20 to 40% lower than it should be. If they had been, let's say, the people who were medical doctors were actually put in places where they were allowed to be medical doctors to practice without discrimination, we all would be richer. The entire country would be richer. There are all kinds of calculations being done now about the racial wealth gap. There's one estimate from the new head of the conference board, the new chief economist for the conference board, Dana Peterson, who says that the economy could be $16 trillion richer had there not been systemic racism. So other people are doing the work. I just put this research out in the ether, out in the academy, and other people have run with it. And I think that it's the right thing to do. I have an article coming out. Hopefully it'll be out by the time this is aired in the New York Times, summarizing some of this work, introducing this work to the American public. But it's dire, and it's not just African Americans. It's not just, individuals would be richer if there were more African Americans and women participating in the innovation economy. The entire economy would be richer. And what you have to say to those people at firms where patent teams are segregated, what you have to ask is, are you making the best use of the talent you have? If I were a shareholder, I would say you're underutilizing your talent, underutilizing your human resources, because we could be richer if we had more people on patent teams. I mean, one of the key findings of one of my first papers using these data showed that single-sex teams were less productive than mixed-gender teams. So if you are allowing single-sex teams to exist, that means that you are underutilizing the talent that you have in your firm, at your university, wherever the invention and innovation are taking place. There's a lot of evidence. This is just one bit of it, a lot of evidence.
Well, I think that, I don't know when corporate America generally, the world generally, will learn the lesson that the data seems to be playing out in the work that you've done and the work that many other folks have done, in that diversity and diverse teams get better results. They make more money. They grow the economy more. And so by not embracing diversity up, down, and across, we're actually leaving money on the table, Absolutely. As we would say in negotiations. Yes. And not getting behind that. I have frequently said that if I was a shareholder and I saw this in organizations, I would be furious, because I'd be furious because you're not getting the best results. And I know you're not getting the best results because the data show that diversity leads to better results.
Right. That's right. I mean, the evidence is just mounting, right?
It is.
In California, they've adopted this law whereby all public companies have to have at least one woman on the board. Now, they took their evidence from Europe, where this has been very successful in diversifying boards and getting better outcomes for these companies, for these firms. Now, I would say that not only should California do that, should Californian companies do that, but all companies in all of the US, if not everywhere, should do that. I mean, if it was successful in Europe and it's proving to be successful in California, why not deploy something like that, and not just for gender, but also for race?
Well, one question I want to ask you before, and this kind of goes back to the beginning of some of the work that you've done, and that is, now today, this is all the rage. Everybody is talking about this. Everybody is saying, oh my gosh, this diversity thing, and yes, innovation, diversity. But when you first started proposing this research, what was the reaction?
Oh, Phyllis, it was starkly different. I was told from the outset, when I was shopping the idea, I was told by senior women in economics that if I solely focused on women and African Americans, I wouldn't get tenure. And if I hadn't moved to Stanford, where I talked to Ken Arrow and to Milton Friedman and other Nobel laureates who were intrigued by what I was doing and who were so encouraging. And they urged me, like, you've really got to publish this research. This is one of the, I mean, Milton Friedman said, this is one of the best ideas I've heard in a generation. You've brought together all these data and you have a ton of questions that will follow. And there are 4 different research teams, just to verify what he's saying. There are 4 different research teams following up on extensions of that one paper, of my 2014 paper, whether it's Black names or lynchings or patenting by African American. There are 4 different ones, or segregation, 4 different ones following up on this research. So in that sense, you know, citations are everything, and besides publication, citations are everything. It's finally getting cited. And this Planet Money episode, this podcast, well, there's several of them and I appreciate them for it. They talked about the evolution of that paper. People did not believe it. I was writing many dissertations to defend the results. When I got to the referee process, it was very different from the encouragement that I got from Nobel laureates. It was really a strange thing, but it was also telling, because there was basic information about our history that my colleagues didn't know and that they were defensive about. And they had a sense that there were some terms that were only to be used for, say, South Americans or for political prisoners in Spain or something. But when I talked about lynchings as extrajudicial killings, I was just like, well, this is from the human rights literature, like that's not controversial. But they rejected that as if there's a hierarchy of types of punishment, or what you call these types of punishment. I think that many of my colleagues didn't believe that anything that related to African Americans could be generalized. Well, you know, the people who, after I gave this paper in my seminars, the people who lined up to talk to me or engage me during this seminar were mainly from China, from Russia, from Ukraine. They got it. It was intuitive to them. And that is the lesson of this. And like I said, I was speaking to the Russians. I was trying to help them figure out what conditions they actually needed. Well, they needed to protect people. They needed personal security. They needed the rule of law to be protected so that they could build on intellectual property rights. And that's when innovation might come. So this was something that was broadly applicable, but their mindset was, and I'm not sure it's changed, that anything that relates to a small population, be it Native Americans or African Americans, not of general interest. And I would say that's absolutely not the case. That's where the innovation comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I could talk to you about this all day long, all night long, because I am just so excited now that people are really, the communities are really tuning into just the insidious impact and the long-standing impact of discrimination, violence, and exclusion, so that we can understand that how much we've left on the table. So I am anxious to see sort of the next things that you do. I am anxious to observe the work that the people that take your work to the next step. And I am so thrilled that you could come and chat with us today in this. You know, we are the facilitators a lot of times of the codified innovation, you know, patent attorneys and IP folks. And so we're really, admittedly so, we're not as diverse a community as we should be. So I'm working on that too. But but so thrilled that you're here. And I thank you so much. I really do. And keep up the good work.
Again, the pleasure was all mine, Phyllis. Thank you.